Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ian Proud. I was, didn't already know, senior based at the British Embassy in Moscow from 2014 to 2019. I was in His Majesty's diplomatic service for 24 years, and I left in 2023. And Russia took up a lot of my time, too much of my time in many ways, including authorizing about half of UK sanctions against Russia, although I consider sanctions policy to have been a catastrophic failure. I am the peacemonger, and my focus now is on bringing an end to conflicts, not just in Ukraine, of course, but everywhere in the world. Welcome to the show. And Dr. Jennifer. Dr. Kavanagh is a senior fellow and director of military research at the Defence Priorities, as well as being an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And I may well have missed something off, Jennifer, but please correct me if I'm wrong on anything. But most of all, welcome to the show.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.
So I thought we'd focus on Ukraine. Well, right now, you had a really good article, a short article today in UnHerd about the focus on territory on the Donbass and possible Ukrainian withdrawal from the Donbass, not actually signaling the end of the war with Russia. I was wondering if you could unpack that a bit for the watchers.
Sure. Well, there's been a lot of focus on territory, especially since Trump came back into the White House. The current U.S. administration has really framed the end of the war as a trade-off between security guarantees and territory. And J.D. Vance said it explicitly back in August. He said, Ukraine wants security guarantees and the Russians want territory. And so there's this idea that if Ukraine withdraws from the rest of the Donbass, the piece that they still control, the war will end. They'll get some security guarantees from the United States, and Russia will be satisfied with that. And in my view, it's not the right formula. It won't end the war. It puts way too much importance on territory. And territory is not the main reason that this war started. This war started because of a disagreement over Ukraine's security alignment. Would it be part of Russia's sphere of influence? Would it be a buffer, a neutral buffer, or would it be part of Europe and the West? And that's what the war is about. So territory doesn't actually solve that problem. Now, territory has become more important over the course of the war because both sides have spent so much time and spilled so much blood fighting for it, but it's still not the primary driver of the war. So on the Russian side, this demand for more territory, some people read this as proof that this war is about Putin's imperialistic desires. But in my view, this demand that Ukraine withdraw from the rest of the Donbass is really about a political signal. The withdrawal would signal to the world that Ukraine was giving up, that Ukraine was surrendering, that Russia had won the war. And this would be a big political victory for Putin. But that wouldn't be the end of it. Russia still wants to talk about all the issues that started the war. Ukraine's security alignment. Will it be non-aligned? Will it be in some kind of alliance or not? They want to talk about Ukraine's military capabilities. They want to talk about Russian language and the Russian Orthodox Church. These issues will only be litigated after the territorial withdrawal in Russia's view. Now, on the Ukrainian side, this war is also about security. It's not really about the territory. Of course, Ukraine doesn't want to give up more territory, and the territory that it's being asked to concede is especially valuable because of the defensive fortifications built there. But Ukrainian leaders might be willing, and even the Ukrainian public might be willing to part with that territory if they could be assured that the war wouldn't restart again. If they could be assured of, ironclad Western security guarantees that they could really count on, if they could be sure that their own military would be sufficient to defend themselves and sufficiently armed to defend the remaining territory. But right now, the terms of peace don't provide them that. The guarantees being offered aren't really credible. They're kind of weak. We still don't know what Ukraine's military is going to look like after the war. We don't know what this prosperity deal will look like. And so it's an impossible trade-off right now for the Ukrainians to make. They can't give up the territory for something empty and uncertain in the future. And so this idea that we're close to the end of the war, like it seems tantalizingly close, but in my view, we're focusing on the wrong things. And once we reorient the picture and get a sense of what the real issues are, we're much further away from peace, but we have a much better chance of getting there with this reoriented focus.
Yeah, I agree. And also, of course, if we get over the line on security guarantees, which apparently Zelensky says we're 100%, there and get something on territory, which frankly is far from likely, that I infer from what you say, will just be an entry point into the bigger kind of peace plan. I know for a fact because the Russian ambassador to London told me a few weeks ago that they see the war running until June, which suggests an extended period of negotiation if some sort of concession on territory and on security guarantees can be agreed with both sides first. And, we've only just started the process of getting both sides together, in Abu Dhabi. So, like you, I kind of feel we're a very long way from the finish line. But nevertheless, I think, security, territory are both important steps, but the end of the beginning, as Winston Churchill would say, not the beginning of the end, if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I'm actually more pessimistic. I think there's a possibility the war could end this year. I think June is way too optimistic. I think possibly by the end of the year. I think 2027 may be more likely. I think ultimately there is something to the argument that Putin will keep fighting until there are constraints, or at least until the trade-offs between his domestic economic situation and continuing to fight are significant enough that it makes sense to settle. So I could see it going into 2027. I do think on the security guarantees piece, this idea that we're like 100% of the way there, I would challenge that because to me that's a domestic political message that Zelensky is sending to try to keep Ukrainians optimistic in what has been a really brutal and difficult winter where a lot of people don't have heat or water or electricity. I think any security guarantees that are agreed to between the US, Europe, and Ukraine without any Russian input are unlikely to survive the actual negotiation about these security guarantees. So things like commitments of European forces in Ukraine. I mean, Russia has made it clear that's a red line. In my view, they won't stop fighting if that's the terms of the deal. So ultimately, we may not like it, but because Russia does have a battlefield advantage right now, they do have some veto power over what the terms of the deal look like. So ultimately, I think the security guarantees that Ukraine gets will be something less than whatever is being discussed among the coalition of the willing. And I'm actually not sure that we're 100% of the way there. I think coverage of what the US has committed to, and when Witkoff speaks publicly about what the US has committed to, it's still extremely vague. What actually is being provided? Is it just intelligence? Is it some commitment about military forces in the event of a crisis? It's really unclear. And so I'm actually not sure that whatever this 100% of the way there is actually specific enough to count as even like a security assurance or commitment.
Yeah, and ultimately, the best security guarantee that Ukraine can have is an assurance that NATO would be, or not NATO, but some countries will be willing to come to its aid should it be attacked again in the future. When European countries and NATO itself were unwilling to do so when it was attacked the first time around, so there's a fundamental intellectual tension there with what might look like good security guarantees from the Ukrainian point of view. And as you say, the idea, which we keep coming around to, I don't know why, that somehow the British and French can send troops into Ukraine to secure peace is a complete non-starter, and the Russians, it will simply incentivize them to continue, fighting. I mean, that is absolutely obvious, and I worry a bit that people continue to kind of push this idea because they know that it will simply kick the can down the road, of the process, which it just delays things even further into 2027. But when I said June, I said June at the earliest. I mean, he was
Okay, yeah.
basing he was basing that on the assumption that even if we get to the point where substantive negotiations are happening, I know the Russians are expecting that any long-term plan, with a 20-point plan or 28-point plan or whatever plan we're working on, will be codified in a treaty uh, sort of document, and the Ukrainians haven't even started to think about that, nor do they have the kind of team in place to draft that. So I mean, the process itself, when we get to the start line, is going to be at least 6 months, and we don't even know where that start line is. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So you've spoken about armed non-alignment. I was read a very good piece that you wrote, Responsible Stakeholder. I think it was in December. of last year about armed non-alignment. I was wondering if you could explain a bit about what that might look like for Ukraine, both in terms of what they want and actually what Europe can afford, because what
Yeah.
Europe can't afford is a standing army of 800,000 troops. I can tell you that right off the bat.
Yeah, well, in my view, Ukraine's best security guarantee is actually Ukraine's own military force. That is the only security guarantee that Ukraine can count on. I mean, I think that's true of any country, especially in today's world. That the only like ironclad security guarantee is your own military. And I don't have a lot of faith in external security guarantees, but certainly that's true for Ukraine because we've seen in this war that only Ukraine has fought for Ukraine. The West has been very happy to provide weapons and intelligence and logistics, but no forces. And I think we can expect that if war were to restart, the same would be true in the future. There's no reason to think that U.S. interests or European interests are going to change in a way that suddenly it makes sense to send forces and fight a war with Russia over Ukraine. So Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself. Russia has made Ukraine's neutrality or its non-alignment a key piece of what it wants in a peace deal. And I think from Ukraine's perspective, there are advantages to having some kind of formal commitment to what I call non-alignment. Now, neutrality is a legal principle, so it has very specific definitions in terms of what's allowed and not. Non-alignment is a policy concept, which means it's much more flexible. So if Ukraine were to formally commit to non-alignment, the only thing it would really rule out is being a member of a military alliance that would have a mutual defense commitment involved. It would allow membership in the European Union, possibly with some kind of protocol like Ireland has, to protect that non-aligned status, but it wouldn't limit Ukraine's ability to have defense industrial base integration with the West, to do military exercises with Western militaries in Europe, not in Ukraine, but in Europe, to receive military assistance from Europe and the United States. These things would all be fine under non-alignment. Now, it would be in Ukraine and Russia's interest to talk specifically about, what are the terms of this non-alignment and spell it out, because I think that clarity would offer both sides confidence that this would last. It would provide Ukraine more flexibility and prevent the possible return of conflict over disagreements about, what was allowed and what wasn't. But after accepting this sort of non-aligned position, then the key piece would be, what does Ukraine need to defend itself? If Ukraine isn't going to have any forces fighting inside Ukraine other than Ukrainian soldiers, what number of forces, what types of equipment, how much, where is it going to come from? Like what do they need to defend themselves? And so I did actually quite a long analysis, very long report that was published by Defense Priorities. The Responsible Statecraft article was based on that report, where I tried to actually estimate, using campaign analysis, what would it take for Ukraine to defend itself. And I come up with a number of about 250 to 300,000 active duty forces and a reserve force of about the same size. Now, some people would say, well, this isn't that much bigger than their military in 2022 when the war started, so how could this be enough? But we're talking about a differently trained, a differently armed, and a differently organized military. So I think, and also we've seen developments in warfare like drones and things like that I think reduce the demand on personnel. So I do think it's enough. And it would be enough, I think, to make any thought of a new invasion sort of prohibitively costly for Russia. And it's also sustainable for Ukraine with some European support. And it's sustainable in two key ways. Number one, demographically. Demographically, there are real limits to what Ukraine can recruit. This idea that Ukraine can have an 800,000 person active duty military, it's not realistic. Even senior Ukrainian government officials admit that 300 to 400,000 would be the absolute maximum. So my number falls in that range. The other way it's sustainable is economically. Ukraine will need Western support to pay for the soldiers, to pay the salaries. But I think I estimated the cost, and it's not overwhelmingly high. It's a manageable cost. Something like, depending on how high you set the salaries and whether you pay reserve forces, it's like $6 to $9 billion a year, which is not like that much in the big scheme of how much support has been provided to Ukraine. Um, so that's for numbers of personnel. But then in terms of equipment, they would need things, a lot of what they need they can produce on their own. So drones, artillery systems, some types of ammunition, Those are all things that Ukraine can produce mostly on its own. It can produce its own armored vehicles. It doesn't really need more tanks. They haven't been that useful in this war. It already has about 100 combat aircraft, which is probably enough for air defense operations. Not enough if you want to have an offensive military, but given the small number of pilots, probably enough aircraft. So where would it need Western assistance? Primarily in munitions. It can produce some, but not enough. If it wants to build like a year's stockpile, a year's worth of ammunition, so that if conflict restarted, it would have a year's supply. It will need support from the West in all types of munitions, from short-range artillery to like rocket artillery. And it will need support in air defense, both systems and missiles. Ukraine currently doesn't have any indigenous production of air defense capabilities. Some support from the US would be required, especially in air defense. Europe doesn't have replacements. Rocket artillery is another place where US support would be necessary. But overall, it's not all that much Western assistance. I think it comes out to about like 50 billion over 5 years. And the 5 year time period is a post-war time period. That's how long I estimate it would take to get Ukraine the materiel that it would need to have like a really strong, robust defensive porcupine. Um, that would be, in my view, sufficient to deter a future invasion and defend the country. And that's a reasonable time frame. It's about how long people expect Russia's reconstitution to take. So would be feasible for Ukraine to be ready to defend itself in the time it would take Russia to build its own rebuild its military. The last piece then is the long range strike. I think it's a very contested topic because Russia doesn't want Ukraine to have any. Ukraine obviously wants Western assistance in this area. I think sort of a middle ground is for Ukraine to rely on indigenous production of long range strike, but build strategic stockpiles of Western long range missiles outside Ukraine for as a deterrent and as a security guarantee for a renewed conflict in the future.
Yeah, I mean that all sounds eminently sensible, as I'd expect from you, Jennifer. And I also think actually it's kind of reasonable as well. It would be completely unreasonable to expect, Ukraine to completely down weapons and not think about its future kind of defense and security needs when the war ends, and nobody should expect them to do that, including, of course, the Russians. But I mean, Zelensky's been talking about sort of EU membership being, the best form of security guarantee if he's allowed in by 2027. I mean, do you have any faith in that as a notion that actually, if Ukraine is turbocharged into the European Union, that in itself will provide some sort of a defense, for Ukraine over the longer run?
Well, I mean, I don't put a lot of faith in Article 42.7 as being sort of like a mutual defense clause. I mean, if you read it, it's really a mutual assistance clause, which suggests that Europe would provide assistance. And I agree, Europe would provide assistance, but it would probably be weapons and intelligence sharing, and other types of logistical support, not forces inside Ukraine. So I don't see it as a guarantee in the sense that it would mean that European forces would deploy into Ukraine. It would provide some support through Article 42.7, but I do think that there would likely be aid promised in a future contingency as part of a security guarantee. So while I don't see like a NATO style security guarantee in Ukraine's future, I do think that Western countries would likely be willing to commit to say, if war restarts, we will provide X amount of weapons, sort of to commit to do what they've already done again in the future. And so I think that would maybe those are maybe overlapping. But I think EU membership would provide security in maybe a different way, which is, first of all, it would provide this, economic and especially defense industrial integration with Europe, which I think would be very important for building Ukraine's defense industrial capability of its own. The more that it can produce on its own, the better. The more independent it is, the better. Then it's not reliant on partners. Having the economic integration, I think, will help Ukraine's post-war prosperity. And I think that's important because if we want people to stay in Ukraine after the war, when martial law is lifted, and we want Ukrainians who have left to feel safe going back, and we want companies to feel safe investing, then you need to have, this stability that I think EU membership might provide if it was if it is achieved quickly. So in that sense, I think it provides security, but it's more economic security, more like it would be a sign of integration with the West that would provide the Ukraine sort of a long-term future. It's less about military security and more about giving it hope that there is a prosperous future ahead. I I guess I'm a little skeptical that EU membership is going to come really quickly. I could see some kind of partial membership coming by 2027 or 2028, but I think ultimately when Ukraine joins the European Union, it will have to be sort of a different European Union than we have right now. I don't really see how Ukraine fits into the European Union as currently structured. And that's why I think that Ukraine's entrance into the EU will probably be like a decade-long process that includes both reforms in Ukraine and reforms in the European Union. But, coming from the US, I don't want to tell the European Union what to do. I don't think the US has a place, deciding whether Ukraine gets into the European Union. That's a decision for Europe and a decision for Ukraine. But that's just my view. I will say that this armed non-alignment model is accepted by more pragmatic, people in Ukraine, whether it's like policymakers or think tank people. And it is accepted by Europeans and by Americans as well as some on the Russian side. So I think like my model might not be perfect, my numbers might not be exactly right, but I do think that it's sort of in the general space of something that would be feasible and sustainable for a long-term peace.
Yeah. I mean, as I said before, I think it is what you've laid out and the effort you put into the research behind it in terms of the paper you did for defense priorities to me, feels about right actually and realistic. Both for the Ukrainians and the Russians and actually the Europeans who will be paying for this essentially. But and I also agree with you on the European integration point that it will take 10 years and actually um, there are just far too many obstacles in the way on the European side, in particular from the Poles, but also from the French, who won't want to incorporate Ukraine on equal terms in terms of the subsidies, both agricultural subsidies, but also the kind of a cohesion, what are called cohesion fund subsidies that can pay for infrastructure in less prosperous kind of EU economies. There's Ukrainian membership will fundamentally redraw, the financial kind of landscape of the EU itself and its member states, which will generate centrifugal forces where some in Central Europe, I suspect, but also possibly in France and maybe even in Poland, think and glance towards the exit door. So it's navigating that is going to be hugely kind of tricky. And I think you're right also that some sort of interim solution, which actually, when he was pranked about 2.5 years ago, Alex Sikorsky, he had that prank call from somebody pretending to be Petro Poroshenko. He actually kind of said as much. He said you might get the flag on the flagpole, you might get to come to meetings, but you won't get some of the other stuff like the agriculture, and it's exactly the Poles that will be blocking them getting that. So whether that's enough of an inducement for the Ukrainians, or whether they quickly become disillusioned with the whole project, of course, remains to be seen. But nevertheless, I think in terms of as you said, the economic prosperity piece, but also the kind of reform, which actually I think most ordinary Ukrainians do call out for in terms of democratic reforms, tackling corruption, having a clean judiciary and all those things that they've been talking about since the Maidan protests, that they could be accelerated by EU integration. But I like you, I think it's going to take at least a decade, and even then, Europe may have been completely recast in that time anyway by wider events. But let's see. But I do think that's one of the reasons why the Europeans are kind of backmarkers, in terms of getting on board with Trump's kind of peace endeavors, essentially because even though they're not going to admit it, in public, peace brings a spectre of tackling these great big meaty questions of Ukraine's membership of the EU. And Macron is not going to admit it. Tusk is not going to admit it, and Sikorsky is definitely not going to admit that. But that's the ugly truth, I think, behind the scenes, that the kind of war is cheaper than peace, for Europe. I think Yeah, I think that's the bottom line there, really, and that's why, yeah, that's why the Europeans are always disrupting Trump's good efforts to kind of bring this thing to an end. I mean, do you see it in the same way as that?
I mean, I definitely see that there are parts of Europe that benefit from continuing the war. I mean, no one wants the war to continue in the sense that everyone hates the suffering of the Ukrainians and the bloodshed and the people dying. Obviously, that's something that everybody wants to have end. But there are certainly reasons why parties in Europe or stakeholders in Europe benefit from having the war continue. Number one, it gives Europe more time to rearm. The longer the Ukrainians are fighting, the more time they have to build up their own military capabilities with the idea that they're next. Some in Europe, I think, use that as a rhetorical device to get higher military spending. But I think some in Europe, especially the Baltic states, actually really do believe that they will be next. And it's hard to. I disagree, but I understand that living on Russia's border would make any small country nervous. So I think there's that. I think politically, a lot of leaders benefit from the war continuing, and certainly there's this EU question and of what do we do in the post-war period, and I think that can be expanded to like post-war. Lots of questions are going to arise. Right now, while the war's ongoing, it's easy to justify additional military aid to Ukraine, additional economic aid to Ukraine, but when the war stops um, it could become politically more difficult. Now, I think it will be cheaper in the sense that the actual outlays will be less, but it's much more politically difficult to get European publics to support more aid to Ukraine, given domestic needs once the war ends. So there's that. I think even there are some stakeholders in Ukraine who benefit from the war continuing and are nervous about having it end. So you think about current political leaders who benefit from being in power, who don't know if once they have elections they'll remain. Questions about the economy. It's going to be a tough economic adjustment. The fiscal situation is not good. What are you going to do when the war is over and all the special measures put in place go away and you have to start paying benefits out to soldiers' families? Like, there's a whole host of post-war questions that I think make continuing the war profitable or at least easier than dealing with the consequences of peace. But the same is true in Russia. For Putin, the war does serve a social stability purpose. It does allow him to have to centralize control and to squash dissent. And Russia too will face the challenge of how to deal with returning soldiers, both financially and in terms of the social implications of having a large number of now unemployed, war hardened veterans return home. So I think for everyone, there's really some incentive to keep the war going or mixed motives. And in the US, I don't think there's any sense in which parties in the US benefit from the war continuing. But what the Trump administration has done is to reduce the costs to such a low level that it doesn't really matter anymore. Like, there's no urgency because Europe is buying the weapons. US is expending very little in terms of economic support. They're providing some intelligence, and then we have this sort of diplomatic effort that's ongoing. But it's low cost and it's low salience in the current US political environment.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, there's so much going on under Trump's kind of chaotic. I mean, don't get me wrong. I actually respect and admire what he's been trying to do to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Absolutely, I do. Although some of his other actions make me sit back and pause if I'm being completely
Well,
frank. But you're right.
it's
It's always a busy time, and he's a busy man, and it's that ability to kind of focus and get something done, which has been lacking. I have felt that the intensity has picked up over the past kind of 4 months. That the intensity that was lacking before the Alaska summit, where it was very, very on and off. But we still feel a long way from the finish line, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely is an intensive diplomatic effort going on here. Don't get me wrong, and I do think that Trump really does want peace. I think he doesn't care what the details of that peace look like, but that's not irrational given the low stakes the U.S. has, I think, in Ukraine right now. But I think the broader point is just that given all the things like on the U.S. political agenda right now, We have, the ICE issue in Minneapolis and elsewhere. We have Venezuela. We have potentially other activities going on in Latin America. We have the Greenland thing, which we just recovered from. We have Iran now. So there's just so much news that Ukraine is just kind of shoved off the front page. And that I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing in the sense that it lowers the political visibility for everyone except people like you and me who are like reading about this every day. It does provide the administration a little bit of space to kind of work on this issue. It would probably be better if it was even more confidential and more quiet in the sense that it would give all political leaders a little bit more flexibility to make compromises. It's really hard right now to make compromises when you're on the world stage and you're forced to back off things that you said were, existentially important. But I do think that that's just the reality is that the US political space, even Congress, right? Like we don't hear any talk from Lindsey Graham right now about the Ukraine sanctions bill. Instead, he's focused on Iran and the Kurds and like a range of other issues. So I do think that it does shape the political narrative here.
Yeah, I mean, Lindsey Graham was behind the Catso Act, of course, in 2017, and but I think we're so far down the track with sanctions now that we really are deep into, well, we've gone way past diminishing marginal returns territory, frankly,
I
on
agree.
sanctions, unfortunately. And to go back to a point you made before, on the kind of, it may serve some politicians, in Ukraine to kind of keep the war going. I think today will always be the best day for Zelensky to kind of sue for peace because conditions are never going to get better than right now, whenever today is.
I
The
mean,
battle.
the reality is that whoever signs the peace deal is probably not going to get reelected. That's the reality.
Yeah,
And that's unfortunate, but it's the reality. And I think I agree with you that the deal only gets worse. But still, if you're Zelensky, uh, you know, do you
yeah.
gamble and hope that you can, like, there's a whole literature, right, on like gambling for survival and how leaders, play for time, and make decisions that seem irrational, in their efforts to play for time.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the Europeans are playing for time too, and the Americans are not in a hurry because they have so many other things on
Yeah,
on their plate. So
too many, too many other crises.
for no one, including for Putin, is this urgent. I mean, in terms of in the corridors of power, as opposed to on the streets dealing with the coldest winter in Kiev since 1987. For those people, I should think it is a very real thing. But for Zelensky, Mark Rutte, all these folk, Putin himself, no hurry at all. And that is of course the worrying thing. But to go back, I had one slight departure from your thinking on the kind of Russian side because. Uh, the Russian economy is just so much bigger, and this war has thrown. I mean, of course, they've been able to generate significant forces, without the need for a general mobilization. But in the process, they now have massive, or at least very significant manpower shortages within their economy as a whole. And so, there will be jobs for people to go back to, and an economy that has remained in comparison to Ukraine, which is totally dependent on life support from Western donors, actually quite resilient. I mean, growing faster, than European economies by some margin, suffering headwinds, growth rapidly slowing down, current account surplus narrowing, inflation high, interest rates high, all those things. But still extremely low debt, 15%, debt. I mean, actually still in sort of fairly decent shape, beaten up a bit, but actually doing better than Europe, which is rapidly deindustrializing, and Ukraine, which is basically bankrupt. So I guess I mean that Putin. I think I get the impression that Putin always calculates everything's relative, on the economy. But yeah, I mean, I think that the social challenge for Russia will be the rehabilitation of troops. Particularly those who've been seriously injured. Of course, that those who have died. But I mean that's a political gamble Putin has taken, and actually just inflicting what will be seen in Russia as a strategic defeat on the West if a treaty is signed that actually takes NATO off the table. I think will help him navigate that.
Mhm,
Because that will be such a big victory for him that
mhm.
he will be able to navigate everything else. I mean, that's just my kind of sense of it, really. What's your view on the future of NATO itself? I mean, you were again for the excellent responsible statecraft. I should reach up on defence parties, by the way. I will undertake to do that. You wrote something on NATO and whether the Greenland issue may kind of be yet another thing, sort of ripping it apart when it's already under threat from Putin himself.
Yeah, well, I guess, my view of the future of NATO is not optimistic. And I've had this view for some time, actually, over a year. I think I felt that, NATO's uh, long-term future was rather bleak and that it would likely fall apart in the medium term. I can't put a timeline on it or say how fast it will happen. But to me, the issue is in Greenland. Like to me, the Greenland, um, I don't know what to call it. Scandal, disagreement. The Greenland issue to me was a symptom of a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is that, NATO is an alliance founded on deterring a threat from Russia, or, initially the Soviet Union, and over time now Russia. But it seems to me there's a fundamental rupture over how Russia is now viewed. In the United States, especially under the Trump administration, Russia is just not seen as a major conventional military threat. Everyone recognizes that Russia has nuclear weapons and can execute cyber operations, but that requires a very different military posture, a very different approach. The U.S. has its own nuclear arsenal, its own nuclear triad. It doesn't need to be heavily engaged in Europe or in NATO to protect the United States homeland from a Russian nuclear attack. And otherwise, you see in the National Defense Strategy that was just released, Russia is described mostly as a regional threat, a regional challenge that can be managed. And in Europe, that's just not how it's seen. Now, of course, there's disagreement across Europe, whether you're talking about Estonia or Spain, on how we see Russia. Obviously, Spain feels more secure. It should because of geography. But in many parts of Europe, there is still a sense in which, Russia is an existential or at least a major threat, is the driver of most of Europe's rearmament. This idea that, if war with Russia is not inevitable, as you would hear probably among some of the Baltic states, then it is at least quite likely, and something that needs to be defended against. And I fundamentally don't see how a military alliance survives when the party with the most military power doesn't actually agree that the threat that everyone's been focused on is a threat anymore. So what does it look like? What are we planning for? Well, how do we plan for an invasion of the Baltics if the US doesn't actually think that the invasion of the Baltics is something worth fighting? It just doesn't work. So in my mind, this this fundamental fracture in how we view Russia means that NATO is sort of predetermined to fall apart. It may happen over time. Trump's aggressive language and sort of hostile approach to allies, and certainly, threatening to take Greenland by force. These are things that exacerbate the divide, but we wouldn't be talking about Greenland. Trump wouldn't be focusing his energy on taking Greenland if we actually thought Russia was a threat, because that would sort of, cover over all these wounds. And I think that's what's happened for the past, maybe decade or so, is that we were still all in agreement Russia was a threat, and so it covered up disagreements. So I guess I see sort of this growing divide as impossible to avoid. But I want to be clear that while I do think that NATO is sort of heading towards collapse or breakup or dissolution, I would like the United States and Europe to still be partners and friends. Um, I don't think there's any need for Europe and the United States to become enemies because NATO falls apart. In fact, that would be a tragedy. We have a lot in common. We have overlapping interests. We can cooperate on economics and technology, and there may be some security issues that we want to keep cooperating on. But in my view, NATO itself has just sort of outgrown the world, and that probably means that some sort of major U.S. retrenchment from Europe is necessary over time. But again, it can be managed. It doesn't mean all troops leave. If everyone agrees that some should stay, that could work. But I guess, I'm just kind of raising this flag that I think NATO is on its way out, and we should start thinking about and managing what comes next so that we can have a productive transatlantic relationship that isn't filled with animosity, and doesn't create just more threats, but doesn't also require U.S. security guarantees as sort of like this underlying framework that governs Europe's security architecture.
Yeah, that's quite right. And I read the National Defense Strategy as well. And I mean, the wording was quite clever in saying, well, not that even though the US see it as a reduced threat, not that they don't see it as a threat, but that Europe can actually manage that threat and they have the money to do so because their economies far outstrip the economic value of the Russian Federation. It was, I mean, for what it's worth, I kind of see NATO becoming a looser sort of grouping, less formalized, because I actually think that the US gains too much from it financially anyway, in terms of the defense industrial complex and the proportion of
Mm,
European NATO business that goes into kind of US manufacturers. So a sort of a loose confederation where the
yeah.
Europeans deal with Russia and the Americans deal with China, and actually we're still friends. I mean, for me, it feels more realistic.
Yeah.
But let's see. I mean, on Greenland, the interesting thing about Greenland for me was that people are tearing their shirts and tearing their hair and rolling around in the ashes about all of that. But of course, the US Arctic strategy of 2024 under the Biden administration also, prioritized, the militarization of the Arctic and sort of managing the threats there. So it's not, even though people have leapt up to scream about this. So this is not something that was only a sort of Trump administration priority. It seems to me he's just given it more burnish and more controversy through just saying, "Well, give it to us. We want it."
Yeah, well, I
Because
mean, I think I'm a little bit skeptical of US interest in the Arctic. I think they're kind of overblown and hyped up like all threats are. But I would say that, having some ability to operate in the Arctic is important. It is true that Russia and China are expanding their military presence in the Arctic, which is separate from saying that they are increasing their military capabilities around Greenland. I think that was like the two were conflated a little bit, at least in the US in the debate, that statements that there are Chinese and Russian military presence in the Arctic does not mean that they're around Greenland. Arctic is big. Greenland is a part of that. So, being aware of our ability to operate in the Arctic is important. Being aware of our and protecting our ability to operate from bases in Greenland, that makes sense. But that doesn't require owning Greenland. And both Denmark and Greenland have been very accommodating of anything the US has asked for, except trying to own it. So the problem, I think, here was that ownership itself wasn't necessary, right? We can operate there under existing treaties. We don't even need a new treaty to be able to do what's required for US national security. It was more about this sort of ownership and the needing to conquer, which was, just simply unnecessary. And there was an idea. I think the use of economic coercion, whether it's force, like both were sort of equally unpalatable. I do have to say that, we got like 3 inches of snow here in DC over the weekend, and DC is still basically shut down. So I'm not really sure how well we would do taking over Greenland to start with, but we don't seem to manage snow that well here. So
it feels a bit like England, I have to say. When we suffer the same conditions. Well, I'm in the south of England, so that's actually quite rare for us. But I was just making the point that some people in the Biden administration also had a kind of one eye on green. There's a deliberate, what feels like a deliberate faux pas in the executive summary of the Arctic strategy of 2024. I was just writing something for the Responsible Stakeholder last night,
yeah.
where Denmark isn't even mentioned as one of the European Arctic nations, and that was in 2024. But
Well,
anyway,
I mean, there are certain constants in US foreign policy, and a desire for US primacy and domination is one of them, even on the Democratic side.
indeed, indeed. So look, go back to Ukraine, sort of, and so on. I mean, like you, I think this could well drag on into 2027, particularly now that the financial envelope has been put in place with this 90 billion loan that the Europeans kind of summoned up at the end of last year. I mean, Ukraine joining the EU is not going to happen by 27 if the war only finishes in 2027. Quite frankly, but I think long term, the only real solution is for Ukraine to kind of have, however it's kind of integrate, reaching a combination with Russia as well. when it's only Ukraine integrating with Europe, militarizing, having this armed non-alignment, which I think, by the way, is a very good idea, very good article that you wrote, without some sort of combination, including economic combination between Europe and Russia, then I think the whole thing will remain tense for decades to come. But let's see where we end up. so much, so much water to run under the bridge before we even get to the point of the war coming to a
Yeah, I
ceasefire.
mean, there are some in Ukraine who kind of make the same argument that even an armed, not aligned model is a confrontational model that just sets the stage for the next war. And that a better strategy would be to think about like how do we get to a modus vivendi with Russia? What does a political strategy look like? And there it would point to like Vietnam and how Vietnam has managed to survive as, able to defend itself on China's border since their last war. And it has adopted a very deliberate non-aligned strategy that is very careful about balancing ties with China, Russia, and the United States, right? In 2024, they were the only nation that had visits from leaders of all three countries, Putin, Xi, and Biden. And they've managed to remain on, reasonably good terms with a neighbor who is much bigger and much more militarily powerful. And Ukraine has a different history and a very different geography and a different set of considerations. But again, it's the same idea that for smaller states on the borders of great military powers. Well, I don't know if, Russia's military didn't perform that well in Ukraine, but certainly still stronger than Ukraine's military, or at least has more resources. Have to think carefully about their geopolitical decisions, and that is something that I think under the, rules-based order or liberal international order, we didn't like to admit, but it is the reality. It's better to deal with reality than end up like we are right now in a 4-year war. So
Yeah, well, multi-vector foreign policy feels like a good place to draw a line under what has been a fabulous discussion. Jennifer, thank you so much
thank you
for
for having
joining me today. It's been really kind of thought-provoking conversation, and thank you for the watchers for continuing to support my channel. I'm only 3 weeks in; it's hard to believe so little time has passed, but I'm grateful for all the support you provided. Please continue to like and subscribe to my channel wherever you are in the world. I wish you all very much peace. And once again, Dr. Jennifer Kavanagh from Defence Priorities, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.